It's a great pleasure to welcome him here. Sir Richard.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. Maybe just a little anecdote about the MI6 building. It was Robin Cook, as Foreign Secretary, that agreed that the film company could use that as a backdrop to the James Bond buildings. And I don't recall him really consulting us about it, but I'm pleased to say, actually, it was a model. Very realistic model. Right, I've chosen to talk on the impact of terrorism on national security, proportion or distortion. And it is almost 10 years to the day since I retired. So this is partly a reflection on the aftermath of an aspect of the turbulent period that I was the chief of SIS. And just one or 2 points to gloss my talk. This is a personal view. It's not based on any particular inside knowledge since my retirement. It's largely surmise, and if my interpretation is off beam in some respects, so much the better. And when I'm talking about terrorism, it's essentially terrorism that's generated by radical fundamentalist Islam. Now, let me start off with a quotation from this week's Economist. This week, a brutal band of jihadists heralded a new Islamic caliphate to embrace Iraq and Greater Syria. Its leaders seek to kill Muslims, well, apostates. Actually, I interjected that myself. It's not there in the quote. Non-Muslims, not just in the Middle East, but also in the streets of New York, London, and Paris. Now, you might say this is a pretty odd week for someone to be advocating a more proportionate approach to counter-terrorism, but that's what I wish to do. And I'm not put off, as it were, by the warnings that have been issuing from government and from the other side of the Atlantic in the last few weeks. My starting point is to recall an important fact about how SIS allocated its resources during the Cold War. As far as I recall, it never allocated more than 38% to the threat from the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies. That is to say that even with this single overarching threat, the intelligence community still managed to maintain a broad spread of requirements. And I think that resource stance on the part of SIS could be applied more or less across the whole of the intelligence community during that period. Furthermore, through the late 70s and 80s, the UK also had a serious terrorist problem. And I haven't been able to check my facts because I haven't had time over the last few days, which cost the lives, I think, of more UK citizens and soldiers than I believe Al-Qaeda has done both here and overseas. The place that Irish terrorism and the Irish terrorism threat occupied in our national security stance was always balanced and proportionate to the whole policy. In fact, I think it would be true to say that we deliberately avoided the danger of making our national security policy dance to an Irish jig, though, of course, the resources it did absorb were substantial. Now, between the end of the Cold War and 2001, what we referred to then as international terrorism began to attract more resources. There were the early series of attacks in Lebanon, eventually leading on to the attack on the US embassies in East Africa and the attack on the USS Cole in Aden. However, this growth seemed at the time a natural follow-on from the small-scale but significant problems that Palestinian-related terrorism, Abu Nidal in particular, had generated. And I recall that the allocation of resources then ran at around 5% or thereabouts. And in the bidding round just before 9/11, in terms of the agency's budgets, there was a small percentage increase already in the pipeline. Now, of course, 9/11 changed the outlook, and dramatically. It was a defining event with a before and an after. I would also say that a massive reaction to it was inevitable, because we didn't know at the time what the follow-ons might be. Now, what should not have been inevitable, however, was the way in which 9/11 has come to dominate and still influences our thinking about national security. It has cast a very dark, long, and enduring shadow. Terrorism, the violence apart, is about communication. It's the delivery of messages other than through a political process. And 9/11 delivered a message which was all the more forceful because it was played out live on TV screens in the very heart of the world's greatest capitalist city. A massive response was therefore to be expected, and we observed in those Western nations directly threatened by al-Qaeda a steady and large-scale growth in counter-terrorist resources. Now, given the number of conspiracies that have been dismantled, the number of attacks stopped, that approach seems to have been, at the time, entirely justified. However, to achieve this result, and the agencies have clearly done a very good job, I believe that counter-terrorism resources have grown to over 50% of the resources of the three agencies, and are probably still close to that level or even above it. The key question must be, does the threat still justify this overwhelming deployment? And remember, this is much bigger than the deployment we made against the Soviet Union and its allies at the height of the Cold War. What has happened to the threat since 2001? Now, it's been through a number of mutations, and I'm not so interested in discussing the al-Qaeda mutations, which I would describe as sort of variations on a theme. But I am more interested in what has happened since the Arab Spring. And I believe that there may have been something of a fundamental change. And to illustrate this shift in the genetic sequence of Islamist terrorism, allow me to recount two anecdotes about Saudi Arabia. And I think this is the country to which we should always look first in trying to interpret the current agonistes of Islam. Shortly after 9/11, I was visiting Riyadh with the Prime Minister. And I remember the then head of the GID literally shouting at me across his office, 9/11 is a mere pinprick on the West. In the medium term, it's nothing more for you than a series of personal tragedies. What these terrorists want is to destroy the House of Saud and to remake the Middle East. The second Saudi incident predates 9/11 and comes from a conversation with Prince Bandar, now, I believe at the moment the titular head of the GID in Saudi Arabia. And that was, the time is not far off, Richard, in the Middle East when it will be literally God help the Shia. More than 1 billion Sunnis have simply had enough of them. And that was a chilling comment, which I remember very well indeed. Now, what we have in these two examples is the clearest evidence of the split strategic thinking of the Saudi leadership. There can be no legitimate or admissible challenge to the Islamic purity of their Wahhabi credentials as guardians of Islam's holiest shrines. But on the other hand, they are deeply attracted towards any militancy which can effectively challenge Shia'dom. How much Saudi and Qatari money, now I'm not suggesting direct government funding, but I am suggesting maybe a blind eye being turned, is being channeled towards ISIS and reaching it. For ISIS to be able to surge into the Sunni areas of Iraq in the way that it's done recently has to be the consequence of substantial and sustained funding. Such things simply do not happen spontaneously. Now, the fact is that what we have hitherto referred to as Al-Qaeda has, if we're cool-headed about it, largely failed to mount terrorist attacks successfully in the West compared with what its original intentions were. And this is true particularly in North America and the UK. There are, of course, exceptions, like the Boston Marathon bombing, but these fall far short of achieving any sort of strategic impact. The franchises of AQ have therefore mainly fallen back on the softest of options, targeting other Muslim communities in the Muslim world, areas of peripheral crisis in the Muslim world, northern Nigeria, Mali, the tribal areas of Pakistan, Somalia, northern Kenya, targeting minority communities within the Muslim world. But more significantly, they've become the shock troops in the long-awaited war between Sunni and Shia Islam, currently being fought out in Syria and now to an extent in Iraq. Every significant Muslim diaspora, but especially those in Europe because of their proximity to the conflict, is profoundly affected by this civil but religious war. So its reverberations are now reaching down and infecting our own Muslim communities. Sectarian passions are aroused, and also amongst the young, very easily exploited. But is this radicalization for a Muslim-on-Muslim conflict the same as the specific targeting of US and Western interests that Al-Qaeda conducted before and after 9/11? I have yet to be convinced. I think there's a subtle but important shift in the motivations of radical Islamization. And if there hadn't been, why go to Syria to fight? Go somewhere else to be trained and, as it were, somewhere safer, but then make the West your primary objective and your primary target. Now, I'm willing to be told by authoritative research that this analysis is not correct. But I think we could at least leave the question open until we have a better understanding of what the answer should be. At the moment, we are using the events of 9/11 and its consequences to provide the answer, rather than thinking rationally about the contemporary political causations of these problems. So really what I wish to advocate is the possibility of moving away from a post-9/11 mindset to a different way of thinking and talking about the impact on us of radical Islamist terrorism. Rather than seeing the counter-terrorist threat as a frontal assault on our values and our society, perhaps we can begin to think of it as the byproduct of a tragic but seminal conflict in the Middle East. And if we are an incidental target, bystanders who will occasionally be dragged into the conflict by British Muslims, it does begin to open up the possibility that our national security resources should no longer be dominated by an issue which from time to time can threaten our safety, but does not really wrap itself around our vital interests and threaten fundamentally our national security when it's viewed in a broad regional context. I also feel deeply uncomfortable to see our media making national security monsters out of rather misguided young men from our Muslim communities who, frankly, I think cut rather pathetic figures. Thanks to the media coverage, they achieve celebrity status beyond their wildest dreams and are probably actually encouraged by the attention towards fulfillment of some of their more extreme radical fantasies. Surely better to ignore them and assume the means to control them if and when they do return home are sufficient to meet the threat that they pose. I'm also concerned at the extent to which media pressure may influence our national security policy. If and when there's another successful terrorist attack in the UK, mounted by young Islamists, the blame machine will again grind the whole issue very, very finely. So the threat of this unrelenting scrutiny also contributes to the demand for more resources, ever greater investigatory powers, and dare I suggest that it even the cause of ministers warning us again and again about the seriousness of the terrorist problems we face. And of course, it's somewhat ironic that the media, in attaching themselves to the cause of Edward Snowden, should be obsessed with exposing the consequences of an investigative system, the appetite for which they themselves have partially created. Now, somewhere here I've got it. Right. However, in one important respect, I need to add a qualification to my argument. AQ and its affiliates and successor organizations like ISIS appear to remain fixated on kinetic terrorist attacks. They're relatively easy to mount. It's what they know. The technology is tried and tested, and they appear to be able to draw on a limitless supply of suicide bombers. However, I'm surprised that some of the more chilling threats that we did worry about and should still probably worry about have not materialized. And I'm, of course, referring to the possibility of CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear attacks. A single successful urban attack using any of these methods would probably have very far-reaching consequences. It would represent an escalation that could fundamentally change, in the opposite direction from what I'm saying, how we do counterterrorism, and destroy my argument about proportionality. However, with the exception of a possible radiological contamination event, I think that this threat is more latent than actual. The technology bottleneck is a narrow one. Chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons are largely state-developed and controlled. And unless an ISIS-type movement were to wrest control of aspects of a state program, we should have the means to exercise surveillance and control of that bottleneck. Resources do need to be devoted to monitoring this, but it can, in my view, be done economically by realistic risk assessment rather than very expensive and blanket risk minimization. Now, in an article I wrote for the International Herald Tribune before they changed its name, I spoke of the return of politics, and this was about 2 years ago, the return of politics to the Arab street after a period of stasis and a move away from the threat of large-scale radicalization of the Arab street. What I got wrong was to underestimate the potency of the Sunni-Shia divide and how the Syrian uprising against Assad would mutate into a civil war fueled by this old religious rivalry, and which, not unlike the Spanish Civil War, would suck in proxies on both sides from the Middle East and beyond. And this conflict now extends into the Sunni areas of Iraq. So Sunni Iraq, without the Kurds, is again at war effectively with Shia Iran, who will of course not let their Shia allies be overrun. And unless the Sunni tribal chiefs can again act together to throw out ISIS as they did to al-Qaeda, it is difficult to see how Iraq can be put back together as a single functioning state. And I might add, and though the West's invasion of Iraq was a contributor to the destabilization, I think its impact was small, probably very small significance compared to the larger historical forces now being played out across the region. So in conclusion, I'm advocating that it's time to move consciously beyond the field of influence that 9/11 understandably created in our national security policy. Counter-terrorist activity will remain an important requirement, but it should no longer dominate our national security thinking and planning, rather a problem that we have learned to live with and which should seldom be given, either by the government or the media, the oxygen of publicity. Tracking the progress of this war in the Middle East will itself be an important intelligence requirement, especially how it impacts our own Muslim communities. But we should be looking at that requirement as a major political problem for the Middle East, with ourselves only marginally affected and standing on its periphery. Now, this is a very different way of looking at ourselves rather than as the primary, looking at the problem ourselves rather than as the primary target of a violent and alien terrorist movement. Of course, the weakness in this assessment is that it fails to take account of how the conflict might evolve. The example to call on being the West's support for the anti-Soviet Mujahideen in Afghanistan and the role that the Mujahideen alumni played in the establishment of what became al-Qaeda. However, I strongly doubt that this is a pattern likely to be repeated, despite some of the blood-curdling claims made on our TV screens by young British jihadis. And that is because this new conflict is essentially Muslim on Muslim. Now, to conclude, I expect that Russia's recent behavior in Ukraine will, I'm sure, have stimulated a lively debate in the JIC about the resources which should be devoted to Central European security issues. And I would guess that the resources at the time, given the way that the US reacted to the Ukrainian problem, were inadequate. And with that debate, which I hope is ongoing in mind, it's time to move away from the distortion that 9/11 understandably created in our national security stance. And at the expense of counterterrorism, we should start to increase our resources again that we devote to Russia, to European questions. I'm particularly worried by the rise of populist parties in Europe and their impact on Europe's political future, and to China, which I believe is heading inexorably into what I would describe as the paradox of being strong government but a weak state, and may therefore become a very much more awkward and unpredictable international partner. And as I've said, we must continue to cover the Middle East, but as a political requirement, but without putting the incipient terrorist threat to ourselves at the center of the picture, and in particular, without demonizing our own Muslim community on account of the small number of their young men who are tragically sucked into the conflict and risk returning home in an ugly and dangerous frame of mind. Thank you very much.